Chapter 1. The Transfer. The day started like any other. The same grim routine, the same stale air, and the same distant sounds of a prison that never really sleeps. I was halfway through my 4th month in this place, just trying to keep my head down and do my time. They called it Phase 2 rehabilitation, but we all knew what it was, a holding pen for the forgotten. I wasn't expecting anything to change, but then, out of nowhere, they came for me. "Pack up, you're being transferred." The guard's voice was gruff, almost bored, like he said it 100 times a day. I didn't ask questions. You don't really ask questions in here. But as I shoved my few belongings into a battered duffel bag, my mind was racing. Transfers weren't routine, at least not for someone like me. Guys who get transferred usually have connections or problems, and I had neither. The ride to the new block was long and silent. The only sounds were the rumble of the armored van and the occasional murmur from the guards up front. When we finally stopped, I stepped out into the icy December air and saw it, a towering gray fortress that somehow felt even more oppressive than the last one. This was Block C, a high-security wing known for housing some of the most infamous inmates in the state. I'd heard the rumors. Everyone had. The intake process was quick but humiliating. Strip search, new uniform, new cell assignment. I kept my head down and my mouth shut as they marched me through the labyrinth of concrete and steel. The air here was heavier, thicker, like it carried the weight of the secrets these walls had seen. My new cell was in the west wing, close to the yard. It wasn't much different from my old one. Cramped, cold, and reeking of decades-old sweat and despair. But there was one big difference. The guy next door. The first time I saw him, it didn't even register. He was just another inmate being escorted down the hall, his head low and his hands cuffed. But then the whispers started. "That's him. That's P. Diddy." From the start, it was clear Diddy wasn't like the rest of us. For one, his cell was decked out in ways that made the rest of ours look like broom closets. He had books, real books, not the dog-eared paperbacks from the prison library. His meals were different too, delivered in discreet packages that the guards handled with almost reverent care. And then there were the visitors. While most of us were lucky to get a single letter or a 10-minute phone call, Diddy had people coming and going almost daily. Lawyers, advisors, men in suits who looked like they'd never stepped foot in a place like this before. But it wasn't just the perks that set him apart. It was the way he carried himself. Even in here, he had an air of authority, like he wasn't just surviving, he was running the place. At first, I tried to ignore him. I figured it was best to stay out of his way. But that changed the night he spoke to me for the first time. It was late, the kind of late where the whole block seemed to hold its breath. I was lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, when I heard his voice. "Oh, God." "You new here?" It was calm, smooth, like he was asking about the weather. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I should even respond. "Yeah," I finally said. "Got transferred yesterday." There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if the conversation was already over. But then he spoke again. "Keep your head down and you'll be fine." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't exactly comforting either. Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. I muttered a quick thanks and tried to get back to sleep, but his words stayed with me. Over the next few days, I started to notice things. Small things at first, like how the guards seemed to give Diddy a wide berth, almost like they were afraid of him, or how the other inmates avoided even glancing in his direction. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the block was at its quietest, I'd hear faint murmurs coming from his cell. It wasn't talking, exactly. More like chanting, low, rhythmic, and unsettling. Isla syndrome? One night I saw a guard slip something into his cell through the food slot. It wasn't a meal tray. It was a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Diddy didn't acknowledge it, but I heard the faint rustle as he picked it up. Curiosity started to eat at me. What was in that package? What was he doing in there at night? And why did everyone seem so scared of him? I wasn't the only one wondering. A few of the other inmates whispered about him when the guards weren't around. Some said he was paying off the staff to smuggle in contraband. Others claimed he was performing rituals to maintain his power, even from behind bars. One guy swore he saw a guard leave Diddy's cell looking pale and shaken, like he'd just seen a ghost. At first, I brushed it off as prison gossip, but the more I saw, the harder it was to ignore. There was something off about him, something that went beyond the usual stories of power and influence. The breaking point came a week later, during a routine head count. The guards were lining us up, calling out names, when one of them stopped in front of Diddy's cell. The guard's face was pale, his voice trembling as he muttered something under his breath. Diddy didn't say a word, but the look he gave the guard was enough to make the man flinch and move on. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My cell was empty, the hall quiet, but the sensation was overwhelming. And then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the direction of Diddy's cell. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispering stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost suffocating. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Diddy wasn't just another inmate. And whatever was going on in his cell, I was determined to find out. Chapter 2. The Cellmates Dilemma. The next day started uneventfully, though my mind was anything but settled. The strange whispers from the night before kept circling my thoughts, refusing to leave me alone. Every time I passed Diddy's cell, I found myself glancing his way, hoping for answers, but getting nothing in return. He was always calm, like a statue carved out of stone, completely unbothered by the world around him. My curiosity felt like a curse. I'd been here long enough to know better than to stick my nose where it didn't belong, but something about Diddy and his cell pulled at me. It wasn't just the whispers or the strange packages. It was the way the air seemed different near him, heavier, thicker, almost like the atmosphere itself was bending under some unseen force. By mid-morning, I noticed the guards acting stranger than usual. They avoided Diddy's cell entirely, not even glancing at it as they made their rounds. One guard, an older guy named Miller, who usually seemed unshakable, looked visibly rattled as he hurried past, gripping his baton like a lifeline. He muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. Whatever was happening, it was starting to affect everyone. That afternoon, we were allowed out into the yard. Normally, this was the only part of the day I looked forward to, a chance to stretch my legs and breathe air that didn't feel recycled. But today, the yard felt different. There was a tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Diddy was out there too, sitting at one of the far benches, alone. He wasn't reading or writing, just sitting with his eyes half closed, like he was meditating. The other inmates gave him a wide berth, their conversations dropping to hushed whispers whenever they glanced his way. I found a quiet corner and tried to blend in, but I couldn't stop watching him. He seemed so out of place here, not just because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. While the rest of us shuffled around, weighed down by the monotony of prison life, he moved like someone who wasn't trapped at all. Like someone who was still in control. After a while, I noticed another inmate, a wiry guy named Dean, watching Diddy too. Dean was a troublemaker, the kind of guy who liked to stir the pot just to see what would happen. He leaned over to one of his buddies, whispering something that made them both laugh. Then, to my surprise, He started walking toward Diddy. "What are you, some kind of king in here?" Dean said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. Think you're better than the rest of us." Diddy didn't react at first, didn't even open his eyes. But as Dean got closer, the air around them seemed to shift. I don't know how to explain it. It was like the temperature dropped, and every sound in the yard suddenly felt muffled. When Diddy finally looked up, his expression was calm, almost bored. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dean laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Diddy didn't answer. He just stared at Dean, his gaze steady and unblinking. After a moment, Dean's smirk faded, replaced by something closer to fear. He muttered something under his breath and backed away, leaving the yard completely. The tension broke as quickly as it had started, but the yard was different now. Everyone went back to their business, but there was an unspoken understanding that Diddy wasn't to be messed with. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. Diddy hadn't done anything, hadn't even raised his voice, but he'd managed to scare off one of the most confrontational guys in the block. It didn't make sense. And then there were the whispers. They started up again, faint and distant, like they were coming from the walls themselves. I sat up, straining to hear, and realized they were coming from Diddy's cell. They weren't words, exactly. Just low, rhythmic sounds that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But as the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, like a chant or a prayer. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on. During our free period, I struck up a conversation with one of the older inmates, a guy named Harris, who'd been in Block C for years. "Hey, Harris," I said. "What's the deal with Diddy?" Corey asked. Harris gave me a sharp look. "You're better off not knowing." "Come on," I pressed. "There's something going on with him, isn't there? The packages, the whispers." Harris sighed and leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Look, man, I've seen a lot of guys come through here, and none of them are like him. He's got connections, sure, but it's more than that. There's something about him. Something that gets under your skin. You'd be smart to keep your distance." I wanted to ask more, but Harris shook his head and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my routine and ignore the growing unease in the back of my mind, but the whispers didn't stop, and neither did my curiosity. Every time I passed Diddy's cell, I felt that pull, like something was drawing me in. And then, one night, I saw it. I was on my way back from the showers when I noticed a faint light coming from his cell. It wasn't the harsh fluorescent glow of the overhead lights. It was softer, flickering, like candlelight. I slowed my steps, trying to get a better look without being noticed. Through the narrow slit in the cell door, I could just make out the outlines of strange shapes on the walls, glowing faintly in the candlelight. They looked like symbols, but I couldn't make sense of them. And in the center of the cell, Diddy was kneeling, his head bowed and his hands clasped in front of him. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but I still couldn't tell where they were coming from. They didn't sound like they were coming from him. They sounded like they were coming from everywhere. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was happening in that cell, it wasn't normal. And for the first time, I realized just how dangerous my curiosity might be. Chapter 3. The First Discovery. The image of Diddy kneeling in his cell, surrounded by flickering symbols, haunted me through the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing shapes etched into the walls, heard the whispers growing louder in my ears. I knew I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Something was happening in that cell, something no one was talking about, and I had to find out what it was. The next day, I tried to watch him without making it obvious. Diddy was a strange presence, even in a place as chaotic as this prison. He moved with a calm that felt unnatural, almost calculated. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't react to the shouting or the tension in the yard. It was like he existed in his own world, a bubble that no one dared to enter. And yet, despite his silence, it was clear that he was at the center of something. By the afternoon, I caught a glimpse of something unusual. A guard approached Diddy's cell carrying a plain brown package, small and unmarked. The guard's hands trembled as he handed it over, his eyes darting around like he didn't want anyone to see. Diddy took the package without a word, his expression unreadable, and disappeared into his cell. The guard didn't linger. He left as quickly as he came, the fear on his face unmistakable. I couldn't stop thinking about that package. It didn't look like contraband. Not drugs, not cigarettes, not even the usual bribes that made their way around here. No, this was something different. Something darker. And it was making people nervous. That night, as the block settled into its uneasy quiet, I knew I couldn't let it go. Whatever was in that package, it was connected to everything I'd seen so far. The symbols, the whispers, the way the other inmates avoided Diddy like he was cursed. I had to know what it was. I waited until the early hours, when the guards were at their laziest, and the inmates were deep in their restless sleep. The block was almost silent, save for the occasional groan of the old building settling. I slipped out of my bunk, my heart pounding in my chest, and crept toward Diddy's cell. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency bulbs overhead. I moved as quietly as I could, my steps soft against the cold concrete floor. When I reached his cell, the whispers started again. They were faint at first, like a distant hum, but as I got closer, they grew louder. Voices layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I hesitated outside the door, my breath fogging in the cold air. What was I doing? This was stupid, dangerous, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't walk away now. The lock was standard, but I'd swiped a keycard from one of the guards earlier that day. It was a risky move, but I needed to be sure I could get in. I slid the card through the reader, holding my breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the door unlocked. The whispers hit me like a wave, louder and more distinct than before. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness beyond. The first thing that struck me was the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable. A mix of incense and something metallic, like blood. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the faint light from the hallway barely cut through the shadows. I pulled out the small flashlight I'd smuggled in and shone it around the cell. The walls were covered in symbols, just as I'd seen before, but now I could see the intricate detail. They weren't random scratches. They were precise, like they'd been carved with purpose. My stomach churned as I realized that some of them weren't just symbols. They were names, etched into the concrete alongside the strange shapes. In the corner of the cell, I spotted the package. It was sitting there, unopened, its brown paper pristine. My gut told me not to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. I knelt down and carefully peeled back the wrapping, revealing a small wooden box with intricate carvings. Inside the box was a blood-stained cloth wrapped around what looked like a human tooth. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't contraband. This was something else. Something wrong. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the corners of the cell, but there was nothing there, just shadows, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I backed toward the door, my pulse racing. Whatever this was, I wasn't ready for it. I slipped out into the hallway, locking the door behind me, and hurried back to my bunk. That night, sleep didn't come. All I could think about was the package, the symbols, and the terrifying realization that whatever was happening in this prison went far beyond Diddy's cell. Chapter 4. The Warning. The day began with an uneasy silence, the kind that sits heavy in the air, like a storm waiting to break. I'd barely slept after what I'd seen in Diddy's cell. My head was a mess of questions, but there wasn't time to dwell on them. The guards were making their rounds, and I needed to act normal, whatever that meant now. When I returned from breakfast, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under my cell door. My chest tightened as I picked it up, heart pounding. The note was simple, but chilling. "Stay out of his business. You've been warned." The handwriting was rushed, uneven, as though whoever wrote it didn't have much time. I scanned the hallway, but no one seemed out of place. Inmates moved like they always did, heads down, minds on survival. I stuffed the note into my pocket and tried to shake off the growing sense of paranoia. But it wasn't paranoia, was it? Someone knew I'd been in Diddy's cell. Someone was watching. The guards seemed different that day, too. Hostility wasn't unusual in prison, but this wasn't the usual cold indifference. It was sharper, more deliberate. Miller, the older guard who'd always been fair with me, suddenly seemed unable to meet my eye. Another guard, a bulky guy named Harlow, went out of his way to shoulder check me during a hallway shuffle, sneering as he passed. "Watch where you're going," he growled, his tone loaded with warning. I knew better than to respond, but my mind raced. These weren't random incidents. The guards were sending a message, and it wasn't hard to figure out why. Diddy wasn't just an inmate with influence. He had people in his pocket, people who could make life unbearable or worse for anyone who crossed him. That night, I tried to keep my head down and stay out of trouble, but as the block settled into its uneasy rhythm, something broke the silence. From Diddy's cell came a series of sounds I couldn't explain. Low, guttural noises, like someone whispering and growling at the same time. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like a chant, layered with something primal that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Lagging doubt." Then came the silence, heavy, oppressive, and absolute. I lay frozen in my bunk, my ears straining for any sign of movement, but the block was still, and even the faint hum of the prison's machinery seemed muted. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. The next day, I found myself in the yard again, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Inmates whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward Diddy before quickly looking away. Even among hardened criminals, there was an unspoken rule. You didn't mess with him. I kept my distance, but one of the older inmates, a wiry man named Lou, caught me staring. "You've been looking too long, kid," he muttered under his breath as he passed me. People disappear around him. "Don't be next." Before I could respond, Lou moved on, leaving me with a sinking feeling that I couldn't shake. The whispers weren't just rumors, they were warnings. Later that day, during lockdown, Diddy did something he hadn't done before. He spoke to me directly. It wasn't casual or friendly. It wasn't even a threat. It was cryptic. "You ever wonder," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the silence, "why the walls here feel closer at night?" I froze, unsure how to respond. He didn't seem to expect an answer. "There's more to fear in here than freedom," he added, his tone almost reflective. I couldn't tell if he was warning me or taunting me, but his words stuck with me long after the lockdown ended. What did he mean by fear? And why did it feel like he knew more about me than he should? As the lights dimmed for the night, I lay awake, replaying his words in my head. The note, the guards, the sounds from his cell. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. But I couldn't stop myself. Whatever Diddy was hiding, it was bigger than I'd imagined, and I was already in too deep to turn back. Chapter 5: The Secret Compartment. The lockdown was chaotic, even by prison standards. Alarms blared, guards barked orders, and the shuffling of panicked inmates echoed through the block. From my cell, I could see the flicker of emergency lights casting long, erratic shadows against the walls. Whatever had caused the commotion, it was big enough to throw the entire facility into disarray. As the guards scrambled to contain the chaos, an idea started to form in the back of my mind. An idea as reckless as it was tempting. Diddy's cell was empty. If I was ever going to get answers, this was my chance. I didn't let myself overthink it. Grabbing the key card I'd swiped earlier, I slipped out of my cell, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The noise of the lockdown was a blessing and a curse. It masked my movements, but it also meant I had no idea how much time I had before the guards restored order. When I reached Diddy's cell, the door loomed before me like a final warning. I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Then I remembered the whispers, the symbols, the blood-stained box. I had to know the truth. I swiped the keycard, and the door clicked open. The air inside was thick, heavy with the same metallic tang I'd smelled before. My flashlight cast sharp beams across the cell, illuminating the symbols on the walls and the strange patterns etched into the floor. But this time, I wasn't here to admire the decor. I was looking for something hidden. My hands trembled as I searched. The bunk bed, the small desk, the shelves lined with books. It all looked ordinary at first glance, but then, beneath the bed frame, I noticed something odd. The metal paneling didn't match the rest of the frame. It was newer, shinier, as if it had been replaced recently. I reached under the bed and felt along the edges until my fingers found a small latch. With a soft click, the panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a collection of items that sent a chill down my spine. The first thing I pulled out was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and worn. I flipped through it quickly, my breath catching as I read the entries. They weren't just notes. They were confessions. Diddy had written about secret meetings with powerful figures, rituals conducted in the dead of night, and veiled references to sacrifices made to secure loyalty and silence. There were names, too, some crossed out, others circled with chilling annotations like handled silence. They were missing. Next, I found a small stack of photographs. They were blurry, hastily taken, but the faces were unmistakable. Politicians, celebrities, even a few people I recognized from the prison staff. Each photo felt like a piece of a larger, darker puzzle. One image showed a figure standing in a dimly lit room, their face obscured, holding something that looked eerily like the blood-stained box I'd found earlier. Beneath the photos was a burner phone, its battery removed but still warm to the touch. My fingers itched to turn it on, but I knew better. If this was a lifeline to the outside world, it wasn't meant for someone like me. At the very bottom of the compartment was a folded piece of paper. It was a list of names, written in neat, precise handwriting. Some names had stars next to them, others were underlined, and a few were crossed out entirely. Next to one name, a note read, "Last seen 12/14. awaiting confirmation. Another had the word "cleared" scrawled beside it, underlined 3 times. I was so engrossed in what I'd found that I almost didn't hear the noise. A loud metallic clang echoed from somewhere outside the cell, followed by hurried footsteps. My stomach dropped. Someone was coming. He might be our enemy. I stuffed the journal into my jumpsuit and slid the compartment shut as quickly as I could. My heart raced as I extinguished the flashlight and crept toward the door. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. I couldn't risk being caught here, not with what I'd just found. Peering out into the hallway, I saw 2 guards moving toward my direction. They weren't in a rush, but their sharp eyes scanned every corner as they walked. I waited until they turned a corner, then slipped out of the cell, keeping low to avoid the cameras. The trek back to my own cell felt like a lifetime, every step laden with the fear of discovery. When I finally locked myself in, my chest heaved with relief. But the relief was short-lived. I pulled the journal from my jumpsuit and stared at it, the weight of its contents sinking in. This wasn't just evidence of Diddy's influence. It was a window into something much darker. Whatever power he wielded, it didn't stop at the prison walls. It reached out into the world beyond, touching lives and ending them with terrifying ease. As I flipped through the journal again, I noticed a sketch tucked between the pages. It was rough, almost childlike, but it depicted a room I didn't recognize. Symbols covered the walls, and in the center was a stone altar surrounded by candles. Scribbled beneath the drawing were the words, "The truth lies beneath." My mind raced with possibilities. Was this room somewhere in the prison? Or was it outside, a place connected to the rituals he'd described? I didn't have answers, but one thing was certain. I wasn't just dealing with a powerful inmate. I was dealing with something far more dangerous. The noise outside eventually died down, the lockdown ending as the guards reasserted control. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the prison walls, every shuffle of feet in the hallway felt like a threat. I clutched the journal tightly, knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Diddy's words echoed in my mind. There's more to fear in here than freedom. He wasn't just warning me, he was daring me. And now, with the secrets I'd uncovered, I was starting to understand why. Chapter 6, The Unseen Threat. The next morning, I woke to an unsettling stillness. The usual clang of doors and shuffle of feet seemed muted, almost as if the prison itself was holding its breath. I'd barely slept, my mind racing over the things I'd found in Diddy's cell. The journal, the photos, the list of names. They all pointed to something massive and terrifying, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. As I sat on my bunk, thumbing through the journal again, I noticed the guards walking past my cell more frequently than usual. They weren't just doing their rounds, they were watching me. Their eyes lingered a little too long, their faces unreadable. One of them, Miller, stopped outside my cell for a moment, his expression hard. He didn't say anything, just stared at me before moving on. It wasn't just the guards. The other inmates had started keeping their distance, their eyes darting away whenever I looked their way. Harris, the older inmate who'd warned me before, usually nodded at me in passing. Now he avoided even glancing in my direction. The isolation felt suffocating, but I couldn't blame them. Whatever was going on with Diddy wasn't the kind of thing anyone wanted to be near. During free time in the yard, I brought the journal with me, carefully hidden inside my jumpsuit. I found a quiet corner and opened it, hoping to piece together some of its cryptic entries. The pages were filled with strange symbols and fragments of text, some in English, others in a language I didn't recognize. One entry caught my attention immediately. It listed several names. Some I recognized as inmates, others as guards. Beside each name was a single word, loyal. pending or eliminated. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a journal. It was a ledger, a record of people under Diddy's control and those who'd been dealt with. The list I'd taken the night before was even more chilling. As I studied it, I began to recognize some of the names. Politicians, celebrities, even a few journalists. Each name was accompanied by cryptic notes: handled, compromised, erased. I remembered seeing some of these faces in the news, tied to scandals or mysterious disappearances. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't coincidence, this was a system. As I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, another inmate approached me. His name was Rizzo, a wiry guy with a nervous energy that made him seem out of place in a place like this. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching, before leaning in. "Shirt was in." "You need to be careful," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "People who get too close to him, they don't last long." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone low. "I mean, whatever you think you know, it's worse, a lot worse." His eyes darted around the yard. "Just don't make yourself a target." Before I could press him further, a guard appeared out of nowhere, barking orders for us to separate. Rizzo gave me one last, pleading look before hurrying away. I didn't see him again for the rest of the day. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. I couldn't tell if they were coming from Diddy's cell or the walls themselves. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, layered and indistinct, like a distant crowd chanting in unison. I tried to block them out, but they seemed to seep into my very thoughts, drowning out everything else. At one point, I heard footsteps outside my cell. I sat up, my heart pounding as the door slid open. It was Miller. He stepped inside, his face pale and tense. "You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but if you keep it up, you're not gonna make it out of here." "Why do you care?" I shot back, my fear giving way to anger. "You work for him, don't you?" Miller's jaw tightened. He leaned in closer, his voice trembling. He left before I could respond, the door slamming shut behind him. I sat there in the darkness, my hands shaking. Even the guards were scared. Whatever Diddy had over them, it was enough to keep them in line, and enough to make them desperate to keep me in line too. The next day, the atmosphere in the prison had shifted again. Diddy was different. He still carried himself with that same calm authority, but now there was something else, a subtle menace, like he knew exactly what I'd done. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual, his expression unreadable. It felt like a challenge, daring me to make a move. I picked up Kleiber's placement slip and flipped them open. During lunch, I noticed something else. Harris, who had avoided me since the warning started, suddenly sat down across from me. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow. "Whatever you found," he said quietly, "you need to let it go. You think you're the first one to dig into him. You're not. Then you won't be the last." "What happened to the others?" I asked. Harris didn't answer. He just stood up and walked away, leaving his tray untouched. That night, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The journal and the list sat on my bunk, their weight almost unbearable. Every sound in the prison felt amplified. The creak of the walls, the distant hum of the generators, the faint scuff of footsteps outside my cell. At one point, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving across the wall, too fluid and deliberate to be a trick of the light. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. But it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. When the lights finally dimmed for the night, I felt a heavy sense of dread settle over me. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever Diddy was involved in, it wasn't just confined to this prison. And now, I was part of it. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The yard was cold that day, the kind of chill that cuts right through you. Prisoners shuffled around in small groups, their breath visible in the frosty air. I stood alone near the chain-link fence, my hands jammed into my pockets to keep them from shaking. I wasn't sure if it was the cold or the weight of what I was about to do. Diddy sat on the far end of the yard, on his usual bench. He wasn't alone this time. 2 inmates flanked him, their postures stiff and their eyes darting around like they were waiting for trouble. But Diddy? He looked completely at ease, like he was sitting in the VIP section of some exclusive club instead of a high-security prison. I didn't plan on confronting him. Not really. But the longer I stood there, the more the anger bubbled up. The journal, the list, the whispered threats. It was all too much. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them hiding in my cell. I walked toward him, my boots crunching over the frost-covered ground. The closer I got, the more heads turned. Conversations trailed off, and the yard grew unnervingly quiet. By the time I reached him, every set of eyes was on me. "You and me need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. Diddy didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression was unreadable. He waved off the 2 guys sitting next to him, and they left without a word, disappearing into the crowd. "Well, this is bold," Diddy said, leaning back slightly. His voice was calm, almost amused. "What's on your mind?" "You know exactly what's on my mind," I said, stepping closer. "The journal. The list. All of it. What the hell is going on?" Diddy's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "Careful now. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in a place like this." Salini refrained from looking at him. "Don't play games with me," I snapped, the frustration spilling out before I could stop it. "You've got half the guards in here under your thumb, inmates too. You're running something big, and I want to know what it is." Diddy stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't much taller than me, but the way he carried himself made him seem larger, more imposing. He took a step closer, his voice dropping just above a whisper. "You think you've stumbled onto some grand secret?" he asked, his tone low and dangerous. "Let me tell you something. You've barely scratched the surface." "What does that mean?" I demanded. Diddy tilted his head, studying me like I was an insect under a magnifying glass. "It means you're out of your depth. You don't know who you're dealing with and you don't want to find out." But before I could respond, a loud commotion erupted from the far end of the yard. Shouting, the clang of metal, the unmistakable sound of a scuffle. Within seconds, chaos consumed the yard as inmates began fighting, guards rushing in to break it up. Diddy's eyes flicked to the scene, then back to me. "Looks like your time's up," he said, his voice calm as ever. Before I could react, a group of guards stormed toward me. These weren't the regular patrol guards. They were Diddy's. I could see it in their eyes, the way they moved with precision and purpose. They weren't here to break up the riot. They were here for me. I bolted, weaving through the chaos as the riot escalated around me. Fists flew, shouts echoed, and the air filled with the metallic tang of tension ready to snap. The guards were on my heels, shouting for me to stop, but I couldn't. If they caught me, I knew I'd never see the light of day again. I ducked behind a row of overturned benches, clutching the journal and list like they were lifelines. The sound of boots thudding against the ground grew louder, closer. I had to think fast. My eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. Then I saw it. A gap in the fencing near the maintenance shed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I made a break for it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear the guards shouting behind me, their footsteps closing the distance. I slid through the gap just as one of them reached for me, his fingers grazing the back of my shirt. I stumbled into the shed, slamming the door shut behind me and bolting it with shaking hands. For a moment I stood there, trying to catch my breath. The shouting outside grew fainter as the riot continued to spread. Everyone saw what I just saw and started their own responses. Inside the shed it was dark and cramped, the air heavy with the smell of oil and rust. I sat down on an overturned bucket, clutching the journal and list against my chest. My mind raced, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I couldn't stop replaying Diddy's words in my head. "You've barely scratched the surface." This was more than training. This is what this world is all about. What did he mean? What else was he hiding? And why did he seem so untouchable? Even in the middle of a full-blown riot, he didn't look worried. If anything, he looked like he was in control. After what felt like hours, the noise outside began to die down. The guards must have regained control of the yard, but I knew they'd still be looking for me. I couldn't stay in the shed forever, but going back to my cell felt like walking into a trap. Eventually I slipped down through a back exit, keeping to the shadows as I made my way through the prison. The corridors were eerily quiet, the tension from the riot still lingering in the air. When I finally reached my cell, I felt a brief surge of relief, but as I stepped inside, that relief evaporated. The door had been tampered with. The lock was slightly off-center, and the mattress on my bunk had been moved. Someone had been inside. I closed the door behind me, my back pressed against the cold metal. My hands trembled as I hid the journal and list beneath the loose floorboard I'd pried open days ago. I sat down on the edge of my bunk, my mind racing. Diddy knew. He had to. And now, the walls felt like they were closing in. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corner of my vision, it all felt like a threat. I was being watched, hunted, and I had no idea what my next move would be. Chapter 8. The Escape Plan. The days after the riot were a blur of tension and paranoia. The guards were tighter, the inmates quieter, and every glance felt like it lasted too long. My cell felt smaller with each passing moment, the walls pressing in like they knew my secrets. The journal and list burned in my hiding spot beneath the floorboard, their presence a constant reminder that I had crossed a line. I couldn't stay here. If I did, I wouldn't survive. Escape wasn't just an option, it was the only option. I spent hours turning over scenarios in my mind, discarding plan after plan. The prison was a fortress, and any slip-up would mean instant death, or worse. But then, a sliver of hope came in the form of Officer Grant. Grant wasn't like the other guards. He wasn't on Diddy's payroll, and he didn't look at the inmates like they were less than human. We'd exchanged polite nods before, but now I needed more than civility. I needed an ally. It took days to find the right moment. When I finally caught him during a quiet shift in the laundry room, I kept my voice low, my tone urgent but measured. "Grant," I said, stepping closer, "I need your help." He glanced around nervously. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. "There's something going on in here. Something big. I have proof, but if I stay here, I'm dead." Grant's expression hardened, but he didn't walk away. "Proof of what?" I handed him a slip of paper I'd torn from the journal, something vague but disturbing enough to get his attention. His eyes widened as he scanned the scrawled symbols and cryptic notes. "This is serious," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you know what you're messing with?" "I don't have a choice," I replied. You know what's going on in here, don't you? Diddy. He's not just some inmate. He's running something dark. Grant didn't confirm or deny it, but the look in his eyes told me he knew. After a long pause, he sighed. If I help you, it's not out of the goodness of my heart. It's because this place is rotten and someone needs to shine a light on it. But it's going to cost you. I nodded. Name it. Leave me out of it, he said. When you get out, you never mention my name. Ever. Deal? The plan was simple, at least on paper. During the next fire drill, a routine staged by the guards to keep us compliant, Grant would create a distraction long enough for me to slip out of the block and into the maintenance area. From there, I could access the old service tunnel that led to the perimeter. It wasn't foolproof, but it was the best shot I had. But first, I had unfinished business. The yard was quiet the next day, the air thick with the aftermath of the riot. Diddy sat in his usual spot, flanked by his loyal shadows. He seemed even more untouchable now, his presence a reminder of how powerless the rest of us were. But I wasn't going to leave without confronting him. I needed answers, even if they came with more questions. I walked straight up to him, ignoring the murmurs that rippled through the yard. His bodyguards shifted, but Diddy raised a hand, dismissing them. He looked at me with a faint smile, like he'd been expecting this. You're bold, I'll give you that, he said, his voice smooth as ever. What can I do for you? I didn't bother with pleasantries. I know what you've been doing, I said, my voice low but firm. The journal, the list, the rituals, all of it. All of it has inflamed my veins to become flaming coals. All of it has filled me with shame. Diddy leaned back, his smile widening. And what exactly do you think you know? I know enough, I snapped. Enough to see that you've turned this place into your personal kingdom. You've got guards, inmates, hell, probably the warden, doing your bidding. And it's not just here, is it? This goes beyond these walls. Diddy laughed, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. You're in over your head, kid. You've got no idea what you're talking about. Try me, I said, my fists clenched. I've seen the names, the notes, the symbols. Whatever power you think you have, it's built on the backs of people you've destroyed. His expression darkened, the amusement fading. He stood up slowly, his presence looming over me like a shadow. You think you can fight this? You can't fight what you don't understand, and you'll never understand. Before I could respond, a guard blew his whistle, signaling the end of yard time. Diddy leaned in close, his voice a whisper only I could hear. Run if you want. It won't matter. You'll always be looking over your shoulder. That night, the fire alarm blared, echoing through the block like a siren's call. Inmates filed out in orderly chaos, some grumbling, others using the moment to exchange contraband under the guards' distracted eyes. I moved with the crowd, my heart pounding as I clutched the journal and list hidden beneath my shirt. Grant was waiting near the maintenance door, his expression tense. He gave me a subtle nod, then barked an order at another guard, sending him off in the opposite direction. The door creaked open just enough for me to slip through. The service tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rust. My flashlight flickered as I navigated the narrow passage, the distant sound of alarms fading with each step. My mind raced, replaying Diddy's words over and over. You can't fight what you don't understand. I was happy. When I finally emerged into the frigid night air, the sense of relief was overwhelming. But it was fleeting. I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The next few days were a blur. I managed to disappear into the city, keeping to the shadows and avoiding crowded places. The journal and list were my only companions, their contents haunting me every time I opened them. Names, dates, cryptic references to rituals and sacrifices. It was all there, laid out in horrifying detail. But Diddy's reach was long. I felt it in every corner I turned, every unfamiliar face that lingered too long. The paranoia was suffocating, but I couldn't let it stop me. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. As I sat in a dingy motel room, the journal open on the table before me, I realized the weight of what I held. This wasn't just about Diddy or the prison. It was about a system of power and control that stretched far beyond what I could comprehend, and I was just one man standing against it. But one man with the truth, that was enough to make them afraid. For now, I had to lay low, to figure out my next move, but I wasn't going to stay silent. Diddy might have thought he'd won, but he underestimated me. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. And when it did, the world would know what I found in Diddy's cell.